The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Warm, heavy, tropical rain, the kind that smelled of iron and rot. On the morning of December 26, 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiru Onoda stood beneath the rusting wing of a Kai-48 bomber and waited for orders that would change the rest of his life. The Imperial Army was collapsing. Manila was already in flames, and rumors whispered that the Americans had landed farther north. But here, on the island of Lubang, the world still felt strangely still, like the eye of a dying storm. His commander, Major Taniguchi, unfolded a small map dampened by humidity. "Your orders are simple," he said, voice low. "Delay the enemy's advance. Destroy the pier, the airfield, and every supply they can use. You are not to die. You are not to surrender. Continue fighting, indefinitely." Onoda nodded once. It wasn't courage. It was programming. The kind of obedience carved deep into men trained to believe that the Emperor was not a man, but a horizon you could never reach. They said the mission would last a few weeks, perhaps a month. But as the days turned into months, the months into years, the world itself began to crumble beyond the jungle's edge. Before leaving the camp, Major Taniguchi handed him a small envelope, wax-sealed, plain, and marked with the kanji for private. "Only open this," he said, "when your mission is complete." Onoda placed it in the inner pocket of his uniform. He would never open it. The first few nights, he and 3 men, Shimada, Kozuka, and Akatsu, crept through the mangroves, cutting signal lines, setting small traps, watching the silhouettes of American patrols through the mist. The war was a shadow game now, one side moving through smoke, the other through silence. At night, the jungle sang, insects, wind, and the soft thud of falling fruit. And in that soundscape, the young officer began to vanish. Not his body, but the sense of time itself. Every dawn looked the same. Every sunset felt recycled. In early 1945, the air above Lubang trembled with a different kind of thunder. B-24 bombers passing overhead, wave after wave. They burned the shoreline, shattered what was left of the Japanese garrison. Somewhere beyond the hills, the world was ending. Then, silence. No radio calls, no supply drops, no reinforcements. The men were on their own. By March, the 4 soldiers withdrew deep into the forest. They built shelters out of bamboo and palm leaves. They cleaned their rifles every night, waiting for an enemy that never seemed to arrive. One afternoon, a leaflet drifted down through the canopy, a single page printed with strange English letters, and on the other side, Japanese characters that read, "The war has ended. Japan has surrendered. Come down from the mountain." Shimada picked it up, hands trembling. Could this be real? Onoda studied the paper for a long time. The ink had bled slightly in the rain, but the message was clear. Still, he shook his head. "This is enemy propaganda," he said quietly. "We hold until command returns." That night, he buried the leaflet in a tin box beneath his bedroll, the first artifact of a new, invisible war. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Villagers began to whisper of spirits in the jungle, shadows that stole rice and meat, figures moving in the mist. Sometimes, at dawn, they found footprints near the fields, leading back into the forest. The Americans were gone, but the ghosts remained. Onoda no longer counted the days. He recorded each sunrise in the small notebook he carried, a faint pencil line marking each page. The paper was already yellowing, but he continued, because the act of writing meant the world was still out there, somewhere beyond the trees. One evening, as rain dripped through the roof of their hut, Kozuka asked softly, "Lieutenant, what if the war truly ended?" Onoda stared into the small flame between them. The rain hissed around their shelter like static. "Then we would be the only ones still faithful," he said. and that would have to be enough. Outside, lightning illuminated the jungle, a flash of white against endless green. For a moment, it looked like the sky itself was tearing open. And somewhere in that electric silence, Onoda felt something he couldn't name. Not doubt, not fear, but a quiet understanding that time was beginning to forget them. He lay back, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain. Far away, across an ocean, Tokyo was already in ruins. But here, on Lubang, a single soldier kept his post, the last order echoing in his mind. You are not to die. You are not to surrender. And so, he didn't. He breathed. He waited, and the jungle began to close around him like a hand. And that was how it began. The story of a man who obeyed an order so completely that he outlived the war itself. When the last echo of gunfire faded, silence took its place. Not peace, just silence. A silence so the Onoda woke each morning to the same sound. Wind moving through leaves, the slow drip of rain sliding down palm trunks, the metallic click. The war had ended months ago, but not for them. Not in their minds. He still kept Major Taniguchi's order folded in memory. Those final words, like iron wires, coiled around his thoughts. You are not to surrender. You are not to die. Every day that he drew breath was another line of obedience, another page in a mission without end. The four men lived like ghosts. They built a small camp deep within the heart of Lubang's forest, a patch of moss-covered earth between two rivers, hidden by layers of vines. It was a soldier's geometry, one entrance, one escape route, and 1,000 things that could kill you. Each night, they lit a small fire, covered by green leaves, so the smoke would blend into fog. They boiled water from the stream, dried rice stolen from the edge of villages, and cleaned their weapons as though the emperor himself might appear at dawn for inspection. But the jungle had its own rules. It erased tracks within hours. It swallowed sound. It turned men into creatures that forgot what day looked like. Sometimes, when the rain came heavy, the forest floor shimmered with tiny silver frogs, a moving, living carpet. In that strange light, Onoda could almost imagine Tokyo shimmering beyond the trees. But when he blinked, there was only green, only the hum of unseen life. In October 1945, they found another leaflet, this one printed cleanly with the rising sun emblem of Japan. The war has ended. The Imperial Army has laid down its arms. Please come down from the mountains. Shimada stared at it for a long time. It's different this time, he whispered. They even used our flag. But Onoda shook his head. If Japan had surrendered, the flag would not be used by the enemy. This is another trick. He folded the paper neatly and placed it in his rucksack. Beside the envelope, he still refused to open. That night, rain came again. 1,000 drops tapping the roof like fingers. He dreamed of home, a faint, shifting image of the port at Kainan, where he had last seen the sea. In his dream, the waves were still, frozen mid-motion, like time had stopped there too. When he woke, the dream stayed with him, a ghost he could almost touch. As months turned into years, one by one, the four men began to change. Akatsu grew restless. He wanted to go home, to find out the truth. If the war is still going, he argued, why haven't they sent anyone to relieve us? Onoda didn't answer. There was no right answer, only faith. In 1949, Akatsu vanished before dawn. They found his rifle propped against a tree, the bayonet rusting in the rain. Weeks later, they heard he had surrendered to local villagers. That night, the camp was quiet. No one spoke. For the first time, Onoda wondered if the jungle had already won. He began keeping a new journal, not of tactics or supplies, but of signs. Strange patterns in the weather, broken branches that seemed deliberate, distant lights flickering across the hills. He believed the Americans were still watching them, still testing their loyalty. One evening, as he patrolled near the old airfield, he saw something. A faint orange glow, hovering in the mist, like a lantern drifting through time. He followed it for hours until it vanished into darkness. When he returned, Kozuka asked where he'd gone. Onoda hesitated, then said quietly, "I thought I saw Tokyo." It wasn't a lie, not really. For men who had forgotten the sound of voices, imagination was the only city left. In December 1949, they stumbled upon a tattered newspaper wedged inside an abandoned hut near the beach. The headline was half gone, the ink smeared by humidity. But one phrase was still readable. "Japan rebuilds from ashes." Kozuka looked at him, eyes wide. Rebuilds from ashes. Then it's true. Onoda said nothing. He folded the page carefully, placed it inside the same tin box as the leaflets, and whispered, "Even lies can use true words." That night, as rain whispered across the canopy, Shimada hummed an old march tune, softly, as if singing to ghosts. The fire crackled, throwing shadows against the bamboo walls, and in that flickering light, Onoda's silhouette looked carved out of stone. A man suspended between two centuries, still waiting for orders from a world that had already moved on. Somewhere out there, cities were rising again. Neon lights, engines, laughter. But deep inside the forest of Lubang, time had folded in on itself. The jungle had swallowed everything, noise, history, reason, until only duty remained. And so they waited, for the sound of a plane, for a signal from command, for something, anything, to tell them that the war was over. But none came, only rain, only silence, and the slow, patient heartbeat of a man who still believed that loyalty could outlast the world itself. And in that stillness, Hiru Onoda began to disappear, not as a man, but as a memory that refused to end. The forest had its own calendar. Days were marked not by dates, but by sounds. The first cry of a cicada, the swell of monsoon wind, the rustle of ripe fruit falling in the dark. By 1950, Hiru Onoda had forgotten what a calendar looked like. He still woke before dawn, cleaned his rifle, and recited the imperial creed under his breath, the same way a priest might whisper a prayer to a god that had stopped answering. His world was shrinking, and yet it was enough. The air was heavy that year. Rain lingered longer, and food grew scarcer. The three remaining men, Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka, moved their camp deeper into the hills. The villagers had become bolder, setting traps for them, leaving fake supplies, calling out in Japanese to lure them. To Onoda, it only proved that the Americans were still trying to break their morale. The war, he thought, had simply changed masks. Then one morning, Shimada was shot. They had been crossing a shallow river at dawn, water rising to their waists. A group of local fishermen spotted them and panicked. A single bullet cracked through the mist, struck Shimada's leg, and dropped him into the current. Onoda dragged him to shore, tied the wound with strips of cloth, but the infection came fast. Within days, the man's fever was rising. For a week, Onoda didn't sleep. He talked to Shimada in whispers, about home, about duty, about how this was just another test of endurance. Shimada tried to smile. One night, as the wind shook their shelter, Shimada turned to him and said softly, "If the war ever ends, tell them I didn't break." Then he closed his eyes. Kozuka and Onoda buried him beneath a banyan tree, wrapping his body in a faded army flag. The sound of rain covered their shovels like mercy. After that, the forest grew quieter. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. 2 men left now, two shadows carrying the memory of an empire that had vanished into dust. In 1951, strange things began to appear at the edge of their world. Radios left behind by travelers, aluminum cans, bits of fabric too modern to be wartime. Onoda examined each one, convinced it was proof that the Americans were preparing a new invasion. Then came the voices. Some nights, faint and distant, they heard Japanese on the wind, songs sometimes, or fragments of news broadcasts carried by air currents from villages far away. Kozuka said he once heard a woman reading poetry, a haiku. Her voice trembled with static, but the words stayed. Even in the dark, the plum tree knows when to bloom. Spring never forgets. Onoda never heard it himself, but for months he believed it was a signal, code from the homeland, hidden inside a poem. He recorded it carefully in his notebook, along with coordinates, guesses, possibilities. It gave meaning to the silence, and sometimes that was enough. But the jungle was not kind to believers. By 1953, Kozuka's faith began to fade. He started talking about surrender, about going home. Maybe, he said one night, the Emperor forgave us already. Onoda stared into the fire. The orange glow flickered across his face, reflecting off the steel of his rifle. Forgiveness, he said quietly, is for those who failed. Kozuka looked away. The two men sat in silence, the kind that stretches like a blade between friends. Weeks later, a typhoon hit the island. Trees bent like grass. Rain fell sideways. Their camp collapsed, washed away by the flood. When the storm ended, the forest was unrecognizable. Their supplies were gone. Their fire tools, their notes, everything, scattered. But the envelope, still dry, still sealed, still inside Onoda's uniform. He held it for a long time that night, tracing the edge of the paper, wondering if the ink inside had faded. Then he slipped it back into his pocket. Not yet. Not until command returned. And so, the years went on. In 1955, hunters claimed to have seen a Japanese soldier in rags moving through the trees. Newspapers in Manila ran short stories about the last man of the emperor. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he was immortal. No one really knew. Sometimes even Onoda himself wasn't sure. Because after 10 years of waiting, you start to lose the line between faith and memory, between what you obey and what you invent to survive. One morning, he found Kozuka carving a small wooden boat near the river. "It's just a model," he said, "to remember the sea." They floated it downstream and watched it vanish into the bends of the river. For a long moment, both men stood there, silent, and Onoda thought, if that little boat ever reaches Japan, maybe it will carry our names home. But it didn't. The river kept its secrets. The jungle closed around them again. And time began to echo like footsteps in an empty hall. By 1959, Onoda's hair had streaks of gray. His uniform had faded to the color of ash. Yet every morning, he still saluted the rising sun, still waited for orders, still believed that somewhere beyond the canopy, Japan was waiting for him to return victorious. He didn't know that Tokyo was now a city of glass and light, that the children of the war were now men in suits, that the empire he fought for lived only in books and parades. He didn't know, because the jungle never told him, and so he kept his post, a lone soldier guarding the shadow of a vanished world. Sometimes, at dusk, he would climb a ridge and look toward the horizon. The clouds glowed faintly pink, like smoke from a city just beyond sight. He would whisper to himself, "Hold the line." And somewhere, in that endless green silence, the echo came back, faint but certain. Hold the line. The empire was gone, but its echo lived on in him. By 1960, the world had moved on. Men were orbiting the Earth, Empires had traded their flags for corporations, and Tokyo, once a city of ash, now shimmered in neon and steel. But in the thick lungs of Lubang's jungle, time had stopped breathing. Hiru Onoda still walked his patrol routes, still oiled his Arisaka rifle with care, using a mixture of coconut oil and patience. Still whispered the names of his fallen comrades like morning prayers. The forest had become both his command post and his country. Sometimes, at dawn, he'd catch his reflection in the river, half man, half ghost. His uniform hung in tatters, his body wiry but unbroken. To the world, he was already a myth. To himself, he was still an officer of the Empire. And yet, something was changing. In 1961, a small plane circled the island, dropping leaflets that fluttered down like dying birds. Onoda gathered them up, one by one, and read under the moonlight. They said the war was over. They listed dates, names, even the Emperor's voice proclaiming surrender. But to Onoda, it was a trick. He held one leaflet to the flame of his campfire and watched it curl into ash. If Japan had surrendered, he muttered, someone would have come for us. Orders don't arrive on paper, they arrive in person. Kozuka watched silently. He had stopped arguing years ago, and yet even he couldn't help feeling the pull of doubt. By 1963, the villagers had grown used to the phantoms in their forest. Some left food out in the open, either as an offering or a test. Onoda refused to touch it, but Kozuka sometimes took a little: rice, fruit, dried fish. It's not surrender, he said. It's survival. That night, they argued for hours beneath the stars. Onoda's voice cracked with anger, but beneath it was fear. The fear that if he ever doubted, even for a second, everything he'd sacrificed would crumble. The next morning, Kozuka was gone. His footprints led downriver, then vanished into the mud. Onoda searched for days, shouting his name into the trees, but the forest gave no answer. He told himself Kozuka had been captured, or worse, that the Americans had finally taken him. But deep down, he knew what had happened. The man had walked toward the sound of civilization and never looked back. For the first time in 19 years, Onoda was completely alone. He rebuilt the camp from the ruins, stored what little ammunition he had left, and began talking to the forest itself. At first, it was just muttering, to trees, to the river, to the wind. But over time, those murmurs turned into full conversations, as if he were briefing an invisible superior officer. And maybe, in a way, he was. There was one thing that haunted him more than hunger or solitude: a radio he'd salvaged from an abandoned hut. It barely worked, crackling like distant thunder, but some nights, faint signals reached through the static: music, laughter, even baseball commentary. He didn't understand most of it. The Japanese sounded different now, faster, more modern. But one night, a voice said something that made his hands tremble. Peace. 20 years since the war ended. 20 years. He turned off the radio, sat there in silence for a long time, then stood, took his rifle, and marched out into the jungle as if that single sentence had never been spoken. Because in his heart, the calendar still read 1945. By 1965, stories began to spread beyond the island. Fishermen whispered of the soldier who time forgot. The Philippine army sent patrols, journalists came and went, but none could find him. Some said they'd seen a glint of steel in the trees. Others heard a voice calling out, firm and calm, "Cease your intrusion. The war is not over." He had become both legend and ghost, a man too disciplined to die, too loyal to wake. And yet, there were nights when the world slipped through. One evening, after heavy rain, he found a glass bottle washed up near the riverbank. Inside was a small photograph, two children smiling beside a radio. The edges had faded, but there was something unbearably human in their faces. He turned it over, saw writing in Japanese. "To our soldiers, wherever you are, come home." For a long time, Onoda just stared at the words. Then very slowly, he placed the photo back into the bottle, sealed it, and sent it drifting down the river. "Not yet," he whispered. When the bottle disappeared around a bend, he saluted. It was a small ceremony, for no one but the jungle. But in that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with him, like it too understood the meaning of waiting. And so, the 60s rolled on. Radios grew smaller, nations changed, men landed on the moon. But on a forgotten island in the Philippines, a single soldier still stood at his post, guarding a war that existed only in memory. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the firelight dimmed, he'd imagine hearing footsteps behind him, steady, disciplined, familiar. He'd turn, half expecting to see Shimada or Kozuka or a young recruit saluting in the dark. But there was only the whisper of rain through the leaves, and in that sound he thought he could almost hear the voice of Japan itself, soft, distant, fading. "Hold the line, Onoda. Just a little longer." By the time the first real stranger entered his jungle, Hiru Onoda had been at war for 25 years. The calendar meant nothing to him. The only measure of time was the wear on his boots, the slow fading of the fabric on his uniform, the rhythm of rain on the tin roof of his camp. It was February 1972 when the forest changed its breath. He noticed it first in the birds. Their calls stopped one morning, sharp and sudden, like a warning. Then came footprints, not the broad, heavy steps of villagers, but something lighter, unfamiliar. He followed them at a distance, moving through the ferns with the same silent precision that had once made him a master of guerrilla warfare. And there, standing in a clearing, holding a camera instead of a rifle, was a young man. Thin, tanned, hair too long for a soldier. He wore no uniform, only a backpack, a smile, and the calm curiosity of someone who didn't know danger when he saw it. His name was Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old Japanese traveler who had told his friends he was going on a journey to find three things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. Most people laughed, but here he was. For Onoda, the moment was unreal. The man spoke fluent Japanese, called him by name, and bowed deeply. "Lieutenant Onoda, the war ended long ago," Suzuki said softly. "Japan lost. You can go home." Onoda raised his rifle, not out of malice, but disbelief. The words sounded like betrayal, the kind he had trained his mind to reject. He stared at the young man for a long time before answering. You say Japan surrendered? Then show me your orders. Who sent you?" Suzuki didn't flinch. He just smiled, that easy, peaceful smile. "No one sent me," he said. "I came because I wanted to meet you." And for the first time in almost 3 decades, Onoda felt something strange stirring inside him. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of recognition. They talked for hours. Suzuki showed him modern photos of Tokyo, of crowded trains, of skyscrapers reaching above the clouds. Onoda studied them like battlefield maps, searching for signs of trickery. The faces looked too soft, the city too clean, the soldiers gone. When night fell, they shared rice and boiled water. The young man spoke of a Japan filled with peace and color, of children who only knew war from textbooks, of a country reborn. Onoda listened in silence. Every word felt like a dream he couldn't quite wake from. Before leaving, Suzuki bowed once more. "Sir," he said, "I will return. I will bring your commanding officer." And then he was gone, swallowed by the same forest that had swallowed everything else. For days, Onoda couldn't sleep. The young man's words circled his mind like fireflies he couldn't catch. Could it be true? Had the empire really fallen while he was still standing guard? He took out the envelope, that same one he had carried through decades of rain and fear. The paper was soft now, edges worn. He held it to his forehead. "Major Taniguchi," he whispered, "if the world has truly changed, then come for me." Weeks passed, months. Then, one morning in March 1974, the forest gave him an answer. Footsteps again, steady, familiar, but this time, not alone. When Onoda stepped from the shadows, he saw two figures, the young traveler and an older man in a neatly pressed suit, his posture still unmistakably military, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the same officer who had sent Onoda to Lubang 30 years earlier. They faced each other for a long time. No words, just the hum of the forest and the sound of two lives converging after a lifetime apart. Finally, Taniguchi reached into his briefcase and unfolded a document. His voice trembled slightly, as if reading from another century. "Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, as of this moment, the Imperial Japanese Army orders you to lay down your arms. The war is over. You are relieved of all duties." Onoda's hands shook. He bowed his head, his body stiff with everything he'd been holding in for 30 years. Obedience, loyalty, exhaustion, grief. He removed his rifle, his ammunition, his hand-forged dagger. Then slowly, he placed them at the major's feet. The forest was utterly still. "I have fulfilled my orders," he said quietly. And for the first time since 1945, he felt the weight lift, not completely, but enough to breathe. When he emerged from the jungle days later, villagers gathered at a distance, unsure if they were seeing a man or a ghost. His uniform, though tattered, was spotless. His boots polished, his salute perfect. He was thinner than anyone had imagined, but his eyes, sharp, unbroken, carried the light of another world. Reporters surrounded him, cameras flashed, the headlines read, "The war ends at last, 29 years later." But in the middle of all that noise, Onoda seemed elsewhere. The air smelled different, the sounds too loud, the sky too open. He turned once toward the jungle, his only home for half his life, and whispered something no one caught. Some said it was a prayer, others thought it was a goodbye. Then he stepped into the helicopter that would take him back to Japan, the land he had been fighting for, long after it had stopped fighting. As the blades began to turn, the jungle below rippled in the wind, a last salute to the soldier who never surrendered. Next, Part 6. The Ghost Returns Home, 1974-1980. When Onoda faces a modern Japan, he no longer recognizes, and must learn how to live in a world that no longer needs soldiers. Japan had changed, not the buildings, the streets, the cars, the neon lights, but the very air. Hiru Onoda stepped off the plane at Tokyo's Haneda Airport in 1974, and the world hit him like a wave. He blinked. Too many lights, too many people, too many sounds. No march of boots, no hum of engines, no smell of gunpowder, only the smell of city, fuel, and rain-damp asphalt. He walked slowly through customs, carrying the small bundle of possessions he had with him, the notebook he had written in for 30 years, a few tins of preserved food, and the envelope he had never opened. He wanted to read it. He wanted to unfold the paper and hear Major Taniguchi's words again. But the envelope stayed sealed. He placed it carefully on the shelf in his new quarters, untouched, like a relic of a life that had belonged to another century. People stared. Newspapers, cameras, reporters. And yet, despite all of this attention, Onoda moved quietly, as if he were invisible. He was a ghost, returned to a city that no longer needed specters. He visited his family home. The house had changed, painted anew, the garden trimmed into shapes he barely recognized. Inside, photographs of children, grandchildren, and smiling relatives he had never met stared at him. They were strangers, and yet somehow familiar, faces shaped by a world he had missed. Onoda sat in silence. He could hear the city outside, distant and loud, but it felt unreal. A dream projected into his memories of home. He tried work. He tried school visits, sharing stories of loyalty, discipline, and survival. Young Japanese students stared wide-eyed at him, trying to imagine a man who had fought a war that no longer existed, but his heart stayed elsewhere. Lubang had not left him. The jungle, the rivers, the rain, the night sounds, they had seeped into his bones. Civilization smelled foreign. The pulse of the city was too fast, too bright, too loud. In 1976, he left Japan again, this time not as a soldier, but as a wanderer. Brazil, a small farm in the state of Acre. There, the rhythm of life was simpler. The sun rose and fell. The river ran steady. Crops grew and were harvested. And for the first time in 3 decades, he slept without the constant edge of alertness. Yet, he kept his rifle. Not for battle, but because it was part of him. A piece of memory stitched into muscle and bone. Onoda learned patience again, in a different form. He taught young men how to survive, how to read the forest, how to move silently, how to be vigilant without being cruel. His lessons were about life, not war, but the students could not help feeling the weight of history in every word. He visited Japan occasionally, each time finding it less familiar, more foreign. Children of the war were now adults with their own children. Streets he remembered in youth were highways. Parks had been replaced with skyscrapers. The emperor's voice still carried in ceremonies, but it spoke to a nation that had moved on without him. Still, he walked the streets slowly, observing quietly. And at night, in his room, he would open his notebook from Lubang and read the entries he had made as the forest whispered around him. He would close his eyes and imagine the rain, the canopy, the mist curling through the bamboo. He could almost hear the whisper of Kazuka and Shimada, friends long gone, yet alive in memory. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees near his Brazilian farm, it felt like Lubang was calling him back, a reminder of duty, of faith, of a life lived in total obedience to an order. And in those moments, he would smile faintly, acknowledging the world had moved on. And yet, he had not. He had outlived an empire, a war, a generation. And now, he was learning to outlive time itself. In 1980, he returned to Japan one final time. He stood at the shore, gazing at the horizon where the sun met the water, imagining the forests of Lubang. He whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else. The world has changed, and yet I am still here. A solitary gull wheeled above, its cry carried in the wind. And for a moment, Onoda felt that quiet satisfaction only a man who has fulfilled a 30-year mission could know. The jungle had faded behind him. The war had ended decades ago. And still, the memory, the echo of lost empires, of vanished comrades, of unwavering duty, remained alive in him, quiet as the breath before sleep. The world had changed completely. Cities had grown taller than mountains, trains ran faster than memory, and people no longer spoke of wars that seemed to belong to another age. But Hiru Onoda moved quietly through it all, carrying the forest of Lubang in his bones. After decades in the jungle, after 30 years of obedience to an order no longer valid, he discovered a new battlefield, peace. It was a quiet, strange war. One fought not with rifles or traps, but with patience, adaptation, and the endless negotiation with memory. He traveled to Brazil, to a small farm, where the river flowed slow and steady, where the air smelled of wet earth and fruit trees. He learned to plant rice, to read the weather, to live without hiding. Here, Life did not ask for heroism, only presence. Yet, he still rose early, kept the discipline of 30 years of survival. He taught young men how to observe, to endure, to respect life. Lessons drawn from a war that no longer existed. His voice was calm, deliberate, like a teacher speaking from the edge of history. He returned to Japan several times. Each visit reminded him that the nation he had defended had moved on. Children played in streets he once walked as a boy. Buildings gleamed where forests had grown. Flags waved in peace, not battle. He was no longer a soldier, but the echo of one. A man suspended between two worlds, one of absolute duty, one of fragile peace. In the 1990s, Onoda began writing his memoirs, not just of battles or jungle survival, but of loyalty, endurance, and the strange comfort of obedience. He described mornings when the sun broke through the leaves like a trumpet of light, nights when the rain whispered secrets only the jungle could understand, the loneliness of being the last soldier alive in a war that had ended decades earlier. He spoke at schools and military academies, but always gently. The greatest battle, he told students, is within, the discipline of your mind, the patience of your heart. These are the victories that last. Even then, the forest haunted him. He could close his eyes anywhere. A Japanese city street, a Brazilian farm, the gentle hum of the Tokyo subway, and see Lubang. Hear the whisper of the trees, the drip of rain, the silence of a jungle that had once swallowed time itself. In 2014, when Hiro Onoda passed away at the age of 91, the world remembered him in headlines, documentaries, and books. But the truth, the quiet truth, was subtler. He had survived not because of violence or cunning, but because of faith. Faith in orders, faith in his comrades, faith in a world he barely understood. And in that faith, he had discovered something few men ever do. The strange eternity of living beyond the war, beyond the world's recognition, and beyond time itself. He left no army behind, no medals, no parade, only stories, small, vivid, tender stories, of men who endured, of jungles that remembered, and of a loyalty so deep it became legend. He had carried a war in his chest for decades, yet when he finally breathed freely, he did so with a simple acknowledgement. The battle had ended, but memory, courage, and quiet devotion remained. On his last evening, sitting beneath a Brazilian sky, he closed his eyes. He could hear the forest in the distance, smell the river, feel the weight of 30 years of discipline fading into peace. A bird called, wings slicing the last light of the sun. The wind whispered over the fields, and Hiro Onoda, the man who had outlived his war, exhaled, finally, completely, like a story returning to silence. Loyalty can keep a man alive, or keep him lost forever, and that was the life I was given.